That's right, Bev. It was an extraordinary 24 hours, really starting from Sunday evening and over Monday, right across cities and towns, the length and the breadth of the country. In Israel, we saw hundreds of thousands of people protesting in the streets, not just in Tel Aviv, but in Jerusalem and in other cities as well. On top of that, there were the massive strikes in many industries, the public and private sectors. We saw parts of the country grind to a halt. Those strikes have now ended, and it's now the morning, or the day after rather, and there's a bit more calm on the streets today. Certainly none of the massive crowds that we saw yesterday and into the night. Business has returned a little bit more to what we think of as usual. I'm here in Jerusalem. Shops are open. There are cars on the roads. None of the sounds that you might have heard this time yesterday either, in terms of chanting and shouting. It doesn't mean that any of the fury that Israelis across the country have felt over the last few months, culminating in Monday's unrest, has gone away at all. Certainly the announcement yesterday by Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's Prime Minister, that the vote on these controversial proposals would be delayed, has taken some of the wind out of the sails of the protests, but certainly a lot of that anger will still remain.
Yeah. Tom, do we have any idea at this point? He's delayed it for a month. How is he going to proceed to find some form of compromise around these reforms? Well, that's right, Bev. Now begins a process of talking and listening, nominally at least, between some of the major representatives in the governing coalition. This is a process that will be guided somewhat by Israel's president. These talks were part of what Mr. Netanyahu mentioned yesterday in his address to the country. Now, the word compromise here is critical. There's no indication from anyone in the governing coalition that there will be any compromise. Certainly that word wasn't mentioned in Mr. Netanyahu's speech, and there are elements of his governing coalition that have explicitly said we're not interested in compromise, that we will be pressing on trying to pass this overhaul of the judiciary when the time comes, likely towards the end or after the end of April, without any compromise, that this is a matter of principle for those people, and that these changes they'll be pressing ahead with that. So the talks that we're talking about now aren't necessarily looking to build consensus and with any indication of give and take from the parties involved. So we're not entirely sure what the result of those talks will be as they continue over the coming weeks. Which means if there is no compromise, people will be back on the streets fighting for what they believe are their sort of democratic freedoms. That's right, Bev. The anger, as I say, that many Israelis feel right across the country, not only in Jerusalem, but in Tel Aviv, in other cities and towns. We're talking, you only have to look at those pictures of hundreds of thousands of Israelis that took to the streets only yesterday to get an understanding of the fury that people have been feeling. That certainly won't go away. There might be a bit of more of a return to business as usual over the coming weeks. The momentum that built up thus far might subside, but there's no indication that protests will cease. It's worth reminding viewers that it wasn't just Monday. These protests have been regular since the proposals were first announced in January. In fact, more than weekly in some cases, protests drawing thousands of people in big cities like Tel Aviv. On the other hand, what this might mean for the coalition if the proposal does or doesn't go ahead is an interesting point to raise as well. If the proposals do go ahead, it could suggest a fracturing of his governing coalition. If they don't go ahead, of course, Mr. Netanyahu does risk inciting more public anger as well. Yeah. There are lots of concerns today being raised too about Benjamin Netanyahu's security minister, the far-right partner Itamar Ben-Gvir. It's believed he's been given his own National Guard in return for a delay. Now, we know that there are great concerns about this very right-wing politician having control over a National Guard.
Yeah, well, let's just by way of background, let's remind ourselves of who Itamar Ben-Gvir is. This is his first time in an Israeli cabinet. He joined the cabinet only a few months ago as part of the coalition built by Mr. Netanyahu, who's from the extreme right fringe of Israeli society, certainly not from the Israeli mainstream. He is a settler in the West Bank. He's previously been convicted of racist incitement, of charges related to terrorism, and there are fears among mainstream Israelis, not just the Israeli left wing, but also mainstream Israelis as well, of what Mr. Ben-Gvir's role will be in this new government. And he certainly had a lot of power over negotiations and the policy platform of Mr. Netanyahu's government over the last few months. We saw that in play yesterday on Monday, when Mr. Netanyahu's announcement of the delay in the vote came only after a signal from Mr. Ben-Gvir that he would support that. So Mr. Ben-Gvir is one of the people in the coalition who is pushing to pass these proposals unchanged, without compromise. And certainly the idea of a National Guard under his direct control has worried some Israelis, many Israelis, who might fear the idea of putting greater control into the hands of a man who represents an extreme fringe in this country.
Yeah. Tom, appreciate your time. Thanks so much.